Great. Well, welcome Scott, welcome Lindsay to our conference studio.
Thank you, Mark.
And for the benefit of those people who didn't go to your sessions, first of all, Scott, if you could capture what your session was about today.
Well, I was trying to situate ELT in the broader context of education generally and draw some links between a number of educational theorists who I have a great deal of respect for and have influenced me very much in my kind of professional trajectory. Draw links between them and ELT, second language teaching or English language teaching, and also cobble onto that as a sort of afterthought how the dogma ELT movement relates to that tradition of education, basically.
Mm. Was ELT, do you think, ever connected to general education, or did it become disconnected at some stage?
No, I think, well, modern languages teaching, of course, has always been connected to general education. As with the huge growth in ELT as an industry in the probably dating after the Second World War, but it kind of detached itself and became a discipline in its own right, with its own academic disciplines associated with it, its own research traditions, like SLA, for example. And I think we've lost sight a little bit. I think also because it's being driven very much by linguistics rather than educational theory or psychology, and that's a point that Jack Richards made earlier in the day, that the sort of feeder field has been for a long time linguistics, and we lacked a kind of coherent theory of education. We forgot about the educational side, and I feel that I actually feel more drawn to the educational side and less than, I'm interested in linguistics, but I mean, I think there's, Leo Van Leer said we should rebrand ourselves not as applied linguistics, but as educational linguistics as a field, but it's never really caught on.
Mm. Yeah, and it's always nice to find links, you know, when you see a final plenary to the kind of things that you were doing. Like when you were watching Scott's plenary, could you find any links with the kind of things that you were talking about in your session at all today? Yeah.
Well, my session was a workshop, and it was a practical session on lists, and the question, can I see any links? Well, the immediate thing that I saw, I talked about the popularity. Talked about the popularity of lists and linguistic features of lists, and how these could be harnessed and used as a sort of very minimal input for lessons and activities. Talking about the popularity of lists, as I was sort of doing research on it, I just leafed through the program and just pulled out all the talks that you were using lists as a way of organizing the organizing principles. So we had Jack Richards. He had decided on a list of 10 items about teacher expertise and everything. We had Luke Meddings had organized some teaching principles into 6 sketches about ISTEK. We also had 6 big ideas and 1 little one. Is something that, so there I did see the link, and there's another link as well that Scott had chosen the number 6, which goes back. He'd been doing talks about 6 things before I started a blog, in fact, which ended up being called 6 Things for a variety of reasons. But so that was a link. It's not a deep sort of linguistic or philosophical.
What is it about the number 6? It is interesting. I guess for me, it's like is what you can fit into an hour in a plenary. I think partly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for me, coming back to why we're talking about the number 6 is I have a blog called 6 Things where I collected lists about language teaching, and Scott was nice enough to be one of my first guest blog posts where he talked about 6 films, 6 great films about teaching. And this is what I'd always wanted to have a space on the web where people like Scott, like other people, could share other things, not just that are relate to teaching, but relate to other things. Why did I choose 6? Because 7 Things was taken as a domain name. Because 7 is supposed to be the magic number, like number of telephones and things, number of telephone digits, 7 deadly sins. So I wanted 7 Things, and then 5 was another good one, but that was also taken for some really dubious things. So it ended up being 6 Things.
Right. When I knew I was coming in the role of roving reporter, I was thinking about the interviews, and I decided to bring the book along by Sylvia Ashton Warner that you, I know, were influenced by. When was the first time that you came into contact with Sylvia Ashton Warner?
Well, actually, if you're going to go right back, and this is another talk I do, but it was another book that she wrote, a novel called Spinster. I remember it featuring on my grandfather's bookshelf, and my grandfather was a teacher in New Zealand, and so it was a kind of one of those things that was always around. She was kind of a well-known figure, particularly in the sort of 60s and 70s of the last century. I never met her, although Jack Richards tells me that he did meet her. He just told me that today. And I guess I came across her, I think it was through Mario Rinvolucri, actually, in his book on vocabulary, and the preface to that he mentions Teacher, that book, and about this, and I thought, hang on, this is something I should know more about, because she was a New Zealander, and so I got hold of a second-hand copy of Teacher, and it completely blew me away, because for a start it's so readable, but it's also a first-hand report of somebody who kind of discovers a system of teaching which is completely developed from the ground up without any kind of theoretical input, and it became extraordinarily influential in its time. It's kind of fallen out of the picture a bit for various reasons, but
I mean, it's about 50 years old.
Yeah, well, by me.
Yeah. I mean, one of the quotes, she says, talking about first books, to these first books, they must be made out of the stuff of the child itself. I reach a hand into the mind of the child, bring out a handful of the stuff I find there, and use that as our first working material.
See, why did I miss that quote? I could have used that.
and I was thinking, and one of the things, about dogma, because we wanted to talk a little bit about dogma, and when you look at that quote, that's
fantastic. What page is it?
Isn't it? That's on page 34.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
But I like the word stuff too, because it covers everything in a sense that's generated in the classroom talk. But I see so many analogies. Yeah, in the dogma, is that what you're going to ask me?
Yes. How it works in and how you can train teachers to be
use the stuff,
to think on their feet, to be more spontaneous instead of working with fixed lesson plans.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question. It comes around again and again whether dogma is really just for experienced teachers, for native speaker teachers, for all these kind of questions, teachers of small classrooms, etc. I think people can be trained. I think they can be retrained in a sense. I think a lot of people start teaching sort of thinking that's what teaching is going to be, and then they get kind of like constrained by a method, and then the course books, etc. And they get this. And for some teachers, they need that kind of security. It is the scaffold initially. What was, interesting about our situation, where the dogma, in a sense, was conceived, and the teacher training courses we were running in Barcelona, was because they were in-service courses, and these were experienced teachers, and you'd think they would have learned themselves to use the stuff that comes up in the classroom, but they hadn't, you see, because they were so kind of blinkered and controlled, and they had by the materials and by the method and everything. And so our job was to sort of say, no, as I said today, create some space, move that stuff aside. They can do that at home, and can do it especially at home now with the technologies that are available to deliver all those kind of things. There's an app I discovered for English language, English grammar and use. So there's absolutely no reason to use them in the classroom anymore. So that's so I think it's part of retraining teachers, but I also think there's a place for it on initial training courses, and two colleagues of ours who work in Germany are doing exactly that on CELTA courses, using a kind of teaching unplugged approach right from day one, and it seems to be working effectively.
One of the characteristics of dogma is very much the conversation in the classroom. And coming back to Sylvia's book again, another quote from here, and she says, from the teacher's end, it boils down to whether or not she is a good conversationalist, whether or not she has the gift or the wisdom to listen to another, the ability to draw out and preserve that other's line of thought.
I think the listening is the key. I think that's that side of the conversation. It's not having to dominate the conversation at all. It's to sort of trigger things. That use the stuff that is triggered, and then listen to it, and then come back and do something with it. And it's the doing something with it which I think is a challenge, particularly for inexperienced teachers, because they're kind of like confronted by all this language. What do you do with it? But, I would say to new teachers, well, then having, there's all this language flying around the classroom. They say, okay, stop everybody now, write down what you remember. So once it's written down, it's much more easy to work with as a teacher, even as a novice teacher. You can say, well, take it away, we'll look at it, and come back the next day.
Yeah. And Lindsay, how did you come involved with the dogma thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm a course book writer, so I should also be. But I had come across dogma like many teachers from that famous article that Scott had written, and I'd also found out about the dogma online discussion group. And while I hadn't joined that discussion group, what I found very attractive about it, and what I told my trainees was, regardless of whether or not I agreed with all the points necessarily being made on there, it was a wonderful way for teachers to start developing and connecting with each other online. And if I think about the Dogma ELT group, it came before Facebook, it came before Twitter, it came, all these things that we're talking about, PLNs. When I was training 10 years ago, the only equivalent of a PLN that we would send teachers to were two places. One was the webheads, which was one I'm talking about online, and the other was Dogma, and that was all that we would be able to say. Go out, try to connect, and you could connect with one of these two groups. So I always thought it was a precursor to what started happening. Not that one influenced or created the other, but it was there before all of that.
Before we were doing all of this with the
we're
teacher
doing
trains
now
on Twitter,
with Twitter and Facebook and blogs and all that stuff. But before there were only these kind of little discussion lists, and then ISTEK made their own. I saw Luke Mennings give a talk about it as well, and we got to chatting. And at that time I was working. I'd just been given a job as a series editor for a new series of books for teachers for Delta Publishing. And one of the things I said to the people at Delta, I said, well, why don't we talk to them about seeing if they're interested in doing a book? And I can't remember exactly how it all started, but you had already spoken about doing a book, I think, about it.
Yeah. Although there's a contradiction, obviously, which people don't hesitate to point out, that a book about dogma sounds like it contradicts the principle of sort of materials free, but also it sort of enshrines it as a kind of method, or it might seem to be. But I think the feeling was, after 10 years of this extraordinarily active discussion group, which is still going on, it's like, testimony today of those quotes from that discussion list that I used in my talk, which were literally, one of them I picked up this morning, it arrived, was posted last night. It's still going on 11 years later, but I think we felt that it was too much then. It was like, I don't know how many posts, like 15,000 or something. I said, somebody coming in new can't wade their way through this kind of, and so we felt we need to kind of crystallize some of the thinking, and also the thinking had evolved quite markedly since it started, and it had become, first of all, more global in the sense that we were getting opinions from people from Korea and South America and all over the place. So it was sort of being modified by different kinds of cultures and situations. But also, yes, as I say, I felt it needed to be kind of crystallized into some kind of print form, I think, just to be made accessible, because there still seems to be extraordinary interest in it.
And do you have any idea whether the book is being used on initial teacher training courses?
Well, no. I don't. I mean, it is extraordinary the feedback that I get from, or we get from it. I met a guy in Slovenia at a conference end of last year who uses it in Hungary in a state school at primary level. He uses the ideas from it as adapted into primary. That was never its intention, but it's kind of a wonderful vindication, I think, of the fundamental probity of its philosophy, that it can be adapted to different approaches. I don't know whether it's being used on teacher training courses, no, but it wouldn't surprise me.
I think the other thing about, and from my point of view as this new series editor of a new series of books for teachers, is that it also does quite a lot to validate something. Even in this day and age of blogs, Twitter and everything, something becomes validated, I think, partly when it is put in a book form, when it's given an ISBN, listed, edited, looked over, re-looked over, and then published and sold. That I'm really big into technology, but books still play that kind of important role of of this kind of validation of it, especially in academics or in ELT as well. So, and I come back to it as what I was interested in is teacher development, and see lots of teachers who get interested at dogma at a certain stage of their career. Maybe it's after the initial survival. In my lists talk today, we talked about the 7 ages of man, the Shakespeare quote, and how you can divide life into stages, but also teacher. We looked at a study of how professional life cycle of teacher is divided into stages. And after the first stage of survival and stabilization, there's often an experimentation stage. And I think maybe they should be learning how to listen earlier, but certainly lots of teachers, when they hit that stage, that's one of the first things, if not one of the only things now, apart from technology in a way, but the only principled thing that they want to start experimenting with and adopting as their own. So,
and sometimes the experimentation is forced upon them. And what was becoming increasingly apparent, there were a lot of teachers out there who were doing in-service courses like Delta or Trinity Diploma, and were required to do an experimental lesson, and so they often were choosing dogma, but they couldn't. There was no literature that they could refer to when they were writing this up. So that was another motivation for putting the book together. So, well, here is the literature, and there's a good hefty, 15-page essay at the beginning where we kind of trace the sort of things I was talking about today. In fact.
Oh. Yeah.
The other thing, and again, speaking with my course book hat on, is. Some people, I often get asked to do the anti-dogma thing, where, because I write a course book, and I think that you can use a course book, and I think that you can have lots of those things that Scott talks about. I don't think a book necessarily precludes that, even though sometimes it will. But what I was interested in was talking to Luke and Scott, the idea that dogma is so associated with anti-course books, with an unfortunate comment about the roaring in the chimney and burning the course book. So when in our early meetings with the people from Delta and Luke and Scott, I said, look, can we do something where we talk about what it is and not what it isn't?
Right.
We want to have people say. And that's when they came up with the magic 3 ingredients, conversation-driven, minimal stimulus, focus on emergent language. And that is what I'm happy is getting out, as opposed to 6 years ago, dogma is people who hate course books. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily true. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the same things can be compatible.
Yeah. And finally, we're here at this big conference, and there are some teachers here for the first time and some beginner teachers. What kind of advice would you have for teachers? Jack Richards was talking about how people get involved in the profession and feel themselves as teachers. Would you have any kind of
get a good course book, preferably mine? Well, though I mean,
I would say. Well, I'll say, because you were bound to say it, so I'll say it first. It comes back to that point that Lindsay made before about 10x number of years ago. There weren't the means of becoming part of a larger community of practice that are now available. Well, they were, but they were kind of in a very raw stage in these discussions, etc. But there are opportunities for people now have exponentially grown. The opportunities for teachers to contact other teachers in a similar situation, talk about using the same materials, share ideas about that classroom level about how do you use this page of this course book kind of thing. They can do that now at the click of a mouse, and I would say that would be one of the things I would suggest. And so break down that kind of isolation I think that a lot of teachers feel initially.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was probably what I would have said as well. So.
But come to conferences like this. Too.
And come to conferences or attend conferences online. It's so much easier now to connect to all of that. So that would be my recommendation for teachers as well. And to go for it, to try things and share those. So often we talk about go to get the information and everything like that, but start from the beginning, sharing your own ideas, but keep reading, keep learning, and the first years are hard. You will suffer, but it gets better if you stay with it.
Great. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.